I don't know what to make of the contemporary spiritual counterculture. It seems so pervaded by sophistry. It seems so pervaded by claims to knowledge that aren't grounded in any kind of rational demonstration. It's really frustrating to see groups of people who have access to incredibly potent experiences like meditation, psychedelics, close encounters, who, in principle at least, should be accruing greater and greater stores not only of knowledge but of wisdom, yet who are making elementary philosophical errors. Not even philosophical errors. To call them that would be to dignify the problem. Who are making elementary errors in critical thinking. It makes it difficult for me to know how to engage with the community or the movement as a whole. I ran across this anecdote a couple of days ago that I think usefully illustrates the frustration, if I may. A couple centuries ago, the Pope decreed that all the Jews had to leave Rome. Naturally, there's a big clamor, there was an uproar from the Jewish community. So the Pope made a deal. He would have a religious debate with any member of the Jewish community. And if that person won, the Jews could stay in Rome. If the Pope won, they'd have to go. Now, the Jews realized that they really had no choice, so they picked this middle-aged guy named Moshe to represent him. But to make it more interesting, Moshe stipulates that during the debate, neither side would be allowed to talk. It would be a silent debate. And the Pope agrees. The next day, the debate comes around, people gather to watch, and Moshe and the Pope sit down opposite each other. And for about a full minute or so, they sit there. And the Pope raised his hand and showed 3 fingers. Moshe looked back at him and raised 1 finger. The Pope waved his fingers in a circle around his head. Moshe pointed to the ground where he sat. The Pope pulled out a wafer and a glass of wine. Moshe pulls out an apple. The Pope then stood up, threw his arms up in the air, and said, "I give up. This man's too good. The Jews can stay." An hour later, all the cardinals and the authorities of the church were all gathered around the Pope, and they were asking him what happened. And the Pope said, "Well, first, I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity." And he responded by holding up 1 finger to remind me that there was still one God common to our religions. And I waved my finger around me to show him that God was all around us. He responded by pointing to the ground, showing that God was also right here with us. I pulled out the wine and wafer to show that God absolves us from our sin. He pulled out an apple to remind me of original sin. He didn't answer for everything. What could I do? Okay. Meanwhile, over in the Jewish quarter, people were crowded around Moshe, and they asked him what happened. And he said, "Well, first of all, he said to me that the Jews had 3 days to get out. I told him that not one of us was leaving. Then he told me this whole city would be cleared out of Jews. I let him know that we were staying right here." And everyone pressed him, "Yes, yes, what happened then? What was the decisive moment?" And he says, "I don't know. He took out his lunch, and I took out mine." So I was amused by this. I hope you are as well. To me, it suggests people being caught in entirely separate universes of discourse. There's no meeting place. There's only a play of signifiers on either side that don't have any kind of legitimate interface. And so, in trying to engage with this segment of the spiritual counterculture, it's a lot like that.
Oh, it certainly is. If you consider it from the point of view of the economics of the production of this new age material, in particular the way books are produced and sold and the way authors promote themselves in their books, it seems as if the entire culture is structured around consumption specifically. And of course, when you have a closed universe of discourse, by being a closed universe, it permits consumption. So if I am interested for emotional reasons or whatever non-intellectual reasons may exist, if I'm interested in a particular author or a particular author's message, and I intend to consume it, I want to consume it, I would prefer in a way that this author and his work not be elaborately implicated in another author's work or a group of authors' works. I want to consume it like a Happy Meal. I want to get the feelings from it that I want. I want the themes. I want the basic vision or outlook. And I don't want the potential reality that this book or these books from this particular author may actually be attempting to address. The ultimate reality, in a way, is less important than its ability to be consumed by me on account of the particular messages or satisfactions that it provides, whether a particular book or a collection of an author's books.
Well, I think you're right. The analogy to a Happy Meal is particularly perverse and disconcerting. And as I said, I think it's all tragic because the alternate perceptions community has this tremendous potential, yet we find it everywhere subsumed in narcissism. You often encounter the claim that there's such a thing as my truth and your truth, rather than my perspective and your perspective. There's this sort of equalization of any claim to truth, channeling pre-modern indigenous tribal consciousness, neo-paganism, Wicca, palmistry, astrology, the quantum self, mixed in with an aesthetic from science or from philosophy. People will borrow things from process philosophy, systems theory, quantum mechanics, cosmology, to infuse what they're saying with this aesthetic of the philosophical, with this aesthetic of the scientific. But because ultimate truth is deemed ineffable, people are just falling back on, well, you've got your truth and I've got mine, and truth is something that is personal, and therefore it's all equal, it's all permissible. So we have to settle for a kind of private verisimilitude. There's this psychotic distortion of Kant. If the human mind was in some sense fundamentally distinct and different from the external world, if the only reality we can access is our own experience, then the only world we can ever hope to apprehend is the mind's interpretation of the world. Kant's transcendental epistemology becomes reduced to a kind of pathological solipsism.
Well, this this cultural fact, this willingness on the part of so many today to, hold that. Basically, it's the cultural philosophy of the saying, opinions are like assholes. Everyone has one. The reason why this little epigram is so often quoted is because I think there's a large segment of people, especially in the United States, who believe it to be literally true, as if it's really a gem of wisdom that's literally true without being rooted in some kind of humor or in incongruity. In other words, this idea that anything intellectual is ultimately baseless and totally relative has been a kind of it's been a great liberation for the Great Unwashed. So now people who might have been ashamed in prior epochs, people who might have been ashamed to express opinions on topics about which they knew nothing, or people who might have simply had a silent, hostile reaction. Maybe they would have become physically violent. Now, today, they've been given a bit more free license to, pontificate and offer opinions, and they do so now based on this certain knowledge that personal opinions and personal viewpoints, personal worldviews cannot ultimately be reconciled. That you're entitled to have one, and it's yours and yours alone, and that's all there is to it.
Well, yeah. And, if we encounter this claim that truth is incommunicable and that I can only convey, quote, my own truth, end quote, it's a thinly veiled instance of the liar's paradox. This is a performative contradiction. If this sentence is a lie, has a truth value of true, then it is false. But if that same proposition is false, then it is true. You see, because it's true that in their conception that the truth is incommunicable, then in saying so, they'd be defying that truth by making an objective and general assertion. So it shows itself up as false. It shows itself up as absurd.
Well, this view does consist of being kind of poised on a knife's edge like that, but what seems to me to be the case is that people who are of this mind, what they're involved with differs from, classic Christian piety in the following sense. I mean, they are not people who hold that truth is inexpressible on account of its nature. In other words, they're not saying that truth is ineffable, it cannot be communicated because the nature of truth defies language. Rather, what they hold dear and believe is that truth can always be communicated, but in practice it's never understood. This is why you have so many of them expressing their opinions all the time. They're perfectly happy to talk at someone. And since they have such a conviction that the other person will never understand them and that nothing they say can really affect the other person in any way, that makes them even freer to not tailor their own discourse in the direction of what we would consider to be the real essence of communication. So it's not that the truth cannot be put into words. It certainly can, and it is constantly. It's that this other aspect of communication in which, you and another person for a moment are of the same mind, talking about the same thing, seeing the same thing the same way, that doesn't occur anymore.
Well, I think that there is an element here of the notion that truth is incommunicable. Because in as much as we're talking about the New Age, we're talking about systems of belief that have to do with the nature of ultimate reality. And we're talking about people who are borrowing from the mystical and contemplative traditions of the world, all of which hold, in some way or another, that the underlying nature of reality is yields paradoxical expressions when we try to give it voice in ordinary language. And I think my pet theory here is that this is amplifying or feeding into the tendency that you were talking about, and that the two have morphed into a sort of unholy union, where on the one hand we have this extreme misappropriation of certain currents in postmodernism, of pluralism, of relativism, and on the other hand we have this misappropriation of mystical language about the ineffable. And mixed together, we get the basis for some of the morass in which we find ourselves.
Well, I suppose I don't doubt that. I would situate it, though, in the broader context. What we're talking about is a kind of popular relativism of the intellect. In other words, the point of view of retarded people when it comes to how the intellect should operate. So if you're an idiot on the outside looking in, and this includes the majority of people today, apparently, you would say, well, everyone has an opinion, and there's no way to reconcile the opinions because I know in actual practice, words fail to convey to another person anything that I'm thinking, the perspective I'm taking on it. And that popular relativism of the intellect extends into all spheres right now. You can look at all political discussion, especially online, but on the cable talk shows and even in public places. You listen to these people, and what they do is they each recite a litany of political talking points, for example, and it's simply a presentation to the other without any attempt at real communication. And that reflects this popular relativism of the intellect, the idea that no actual bridging between two perspectives, no real bridging between two minds can ever actually occur. I agree with you probably that this is one part of an at least two-part equation when it comes to the New Age subculture. But that divide of the two parts may correspond to the divide between the New Age figures and the New Age followers. The idea of postmodern motifs or perspectives being in any way meaningfully understood and employed, I think that could only take place here and there in certain quarters when talking about the figures of the New Age movement who maybe have a little bit more intellectual aptitude. When it comes to the followers, I think you're probably right. They misinterpret and misunderstand the already watery presentation of the intellectual concepts of relativism, what we might call a more authentic presentation of these philosophical concepts. And that misinterpretation reinforces the popular relativism of the intellect, which is pervading the whole culture and which, operates in and outside of the New Age subculture.
Well, yeah, it's an important distinction between the leaders and the followers, people who are doing some amount of intellectual work, who are doing some amount of soul searching, who are charting out the territory, whether it's in the space of the mind, or whether it's in some other dimension of reality or what have you. They more often than not rise to popularity for legitimate reasons, because what they have to say is somewhat more carefully considered than what someone else might have to say. And in the case of a figure like Terence McKenna or Carlos Castaneda or Whitley Strieber, we see a certain amount of critical reflection about their own experiences, a good deal of informed speculation about the meaning of those experiences and the potential bearing on human nature and human destiny. But at the same time, the New Age is populated by claims to knowledge that are really grounded in nothing at all. Like, have you ever encountered the lady who's channeling the 35,000-year-old caveman?
No, I don't recall coming across that one.
Well, you're familiar with the movie What the Bleep Do We Know?
I haven't seen it, but I've seen or read quite a bit about it, I suppose.
Well, I mean, this is produced by her organization. This lady appears intermingled with the scientists, let's say. I'm not sure. I think a handful of them actually do hold university positions as scientists. Others simply claim that distinction by fiat. But this lady, it's unfortunate if you're not familiar, she just sort of mixes herself in there. They don't say what your credentials are until the end. People appear with that usual documentary caption at the bottom of the screen, saying, so-and-so is a PhD at MIT, or, they're professor of such and such from Harvard or whatever. There's no captions at the bottom of the screen. They're all just there, and the credentials are shown at the end. And at the end, this weird lady who's been mixed in with all these other people, her credentials go up, and she is channeling this 35,000-year-old enlightened Neanderthal. So, that we've got people like her in there too, and she has quite an audience. If you look at her on YouTube, which in some of my more psychically masochistic moments I have done, and it's unfortunate. There are some things that you just can't erase from the mind. She's up there with, 2 girls, 1 cup, and 1 man, 1 jar. And I apologize if you go and look at those things, but I apologize even more if you go and look at her. But she's got a packed audience of people listening to her reiterate New Age truisms in a particularly half-assed way in this phony voice. So, you've got figures who rise to the attention of a lot of people via their critical thinking, via their soul seeking, and then you've got people like her in the marketplace of ideas, and it's a polluted trough that that people in this subculture are feeding from.
There are a number of dynamics at work, and if we're talking about the New Age culture as a whole, I mean, it would require at least a book to cover all of the ground. A lot of people come to these New Age topics, obviously, because they have a willingness or a desire to believe. That willingness or desire to believe, I think, probably isn't fully fleshed out. They don't come to a particular person for the first time and know exactly what it is that they want to be told. Nevertheless, something exists inside of them that shapes what messages they will accept and enjoy and what messages they will reject because they don't enjoy them. So there's a kind of desire to believe, willingness to believe, which incidentally is always caricatured by science, the culture of science and the culture of scientists. Oh, the credulous public, they'll believe anything. And, underneath that statement, that wringing of the hands, there's always the implied flip side, which is really only scientists understand the world and only scientists are adults intellectually and only scientists, can be trusted to express any rational opinions. So there's an antipathy there which goes beyond the objectively true statement that a lot of the New Age culture, most of it is based on people and their credulous desire to believe. But a question that comes to my mind is what exactly is the New Age? The New Age culture. We take it as a fact, but what the hell is it really? We can start with the phrase New Age, and I guess a rough approximation of its appearance in the 1960s and 1970s, probably corresponding to the whole notion of the coming age of Aquarius. So New Age, probably a shorthand for a movement or a culture that sprung up originally around this motif. Today, you have all sorts of writers in the New Age world who don't necessarily make any motif of a new age of the zodiac their central concern. I mean, many of them omit to mention it altogether. But nevertheless, probably what persists is this general notion that what is needed or what is taking place is some sort of deep and broad shift in the way human beings live, and that this shift references the fact or the phenomenon of consciousness in some way. Consciousness always seems to be a motif they never really get far away from, even though they might forget about changing of the age. Consciousness is always a dominant theme, I would argue. So then what do we have, and how do these individual instances of the New Age culture, these individual authors or these individual groups, how do they all fit within that broader context?
Well, the notion that the movement or the subculture is characterized by the conviction that consciousness is the crucial variable in the equation for the fate of the human species is something to which I'd like to return, because I think that there are elements of the New Age which represent a genuine realization on the part of the culture, and that are coming from legitimate sources that are, and then there are pathological, regressive, dissociative, and narcissistic elements of this, and they're mixed in together. And let's take a look at that first, because the American philosopher Ken Wilber has a very useful concept for talking about this sort of thing. He calls it the pre-trans fallacy. And the idea here is that, let's say that you slice up human development into 3 tiers. You could call them pre-rational, rational, and trans-rational, or pre-conventional, conventional, and trans-conventional. Now, the problem is that an individual or the member of a community can have some kind of spiritual experience, some kind of paranormal experience that is trans-rational. And either they recognize, or the people with whom they're in dialogue recognize, that the experience is non-rational. It's not linear and causal and local in the same way that ordinary experience is. But they then go on to make a mistake which can be their undoing, which is that because that experience was non-rational, as we know rationality, everything non-rational must be spiritual. You see, there's a failure to distinguish between what is a higher manifestation of human potentiality and what is regressing into a kind of infantile, oceanic, pre-differentiated state. What is going from the rational backward to magical thinking, to delusions of self-reference. And because we fail to make that distinction, the data set of the spiritual subculture is tremendously skewed. And there's a good illustration of this during the Berkeley riots protesting the war in Vietnam. A bunch of researchers gave a representative sample of a student's Kohlberg morality test. Because after all, the students there were claiming pretty high values about universal brotherhood and peace and the interconnectedness of life and so on and so forth. And so the researchers were interested to see what stage of development ethically were these students coming from. And so they carried out this test, and they found roughly that something like 20% of them were operating from this trans-rational, trans-conventional state. 80% of them were doing what they were doing for purely selfish reasons. I don't want to be told what to do. I don't want to go and fight. I don't want to be bossed around. And so, in the same crowd, using the same rhetoric, we've got 20% of people authentically operating from this higher ethical and metaphysical tier in their conception of reality, and 80% of the people who are kind of along for the ride, using the same rhetoric, but themselves strictly self-interested, and not even necessarily at an ordinary level of cognitive or moral development. You see? And this ties in pretty closely with something that William Irwin Thompson said about the New Age. Probably about 20% of it is authentically trans-rational, post-conventional, and 80% of it is magical thinking narcissism.
I don't doubt it. I'm sure that is the case, and the figures may be very close to being perfectly accurate. In accounting for why or how that could be, on the one hand, you could take a moral point of view and fault that great 80% for being morally deficient in, failing to rise to the higher level, and so through their inaction, committing an immoral act. But if you're going to look at it in more strictly causal terms, it is certainly possible to suppose that the random distribution of aptitudes and capacities in the human population are behind it. That 20% figure may hold across the board in just about everything. You might have 20% of the people who are able to engage in thinking or thought as we might suppose it exists, as being a relatively independent activity, independent of becoming mired down in more of the obvious, cartoonish, baser motives and that kind of thing. Where there's a certain degree of cognitive freedom when it comes to manipulating ideas, thinking about existing circumstances, and so on. But then you've got simply, unfortunately, a great number of people who, for whatever reason, have not broken through to that level of reality. They haven't. Maybe it's genetic, maybe it's environmental, maybe it's a combination. They aren't actually thinking. They're simply, to risk overusing that term, they're simply identifying. They're organizing themselves around ideas, but they're not experiencing those ideas at the level of thought. They're experiencing them purely at an evocative level, at the level of associations and emotional reactions, something which is probably less complex, so on and so forth. So what do you do in that case? I mean, if there is some sort of general rule which signifies that at present, maybe 80% of any given population is composed of people who aren't really engaged in any real thinking. And if we accept that that is not necessarily just some pure moral failing that you can correct by beating them over the head enough with the fact that they're not thinking, well, then where does that leave you when it comes to, I don't know, redeeming any kind of subculture by trying to rid it of its own stupidity? I mean, it may simply be an impossibility.
Well, I think that Wilber's argument is that the moral failing is a consequence of the intellectual failure. And this is an idea that he borrows from developmental psychologists like Kohlberg and Piaget and Gilligan and so on. The way he puts it is this: a lot of developmental lines are relatively independent. For example, I can have a highly developed mathematical capacity and not have a highly developed sort of kinesthetic or tactile capacity. I could be terrible at coordination. Those are independent lines of development. One can be hypertrophied, another can be severely underdeveloped. But there are some lines of development that are correlated. And if you look at the data set for people's psychological makeup, you'll find a relationship. And one of them is the relationship between a person's cognitive capacity, or the degree to which they're exercising their cognitive capacity, and their morality. If you look at a figure like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, or Albert Schweitzer, people who are deeply moral, they're smart people. And it seems like a precondition of tremendous morality is the capacity to take multiple perspectives. You might even be able to argue that that's part of what it means to be intelligent, the ability to look at things from more than one perspective. But that's not to say that every person who's intelligent is moral. You could have a kind of brilliant sociopaths, and we do have them. But it is saying that you cannot have morality without intelligence, because without intelligence, you're stuck looking at things only from your own perspective. And so you cannot take into account the needs of the other, and you cannot see the ways in which you are implicated in the fate of the other, the ways in which your beings are interwoven. You see?
Well, it's true on its own terms, but There are plenty of cases or instances where people are what we would call quote unquote good and yet totally devoid of intelligence. I mean, you have this whole class of people who supposedly have Williams syndrome, as it's called, where because of some weird genetic difference, they are the most happy, outgoing people in the world, and they're always sociable and thrilled to see people, but it's 24 hours a day, and it's cranked up to a level where it's obviously an oddity. Now, these are people who do not steal or maim or do anything bad to other people, and if anything, they maintain a kind of outward joyousness that in some traditions is considered an ideal, and yet it's probably fair to say that they lack this, theory of mind, as it's called in some circles, that would be necessary for what you're calling, morality. They don't have this kind of developed sense of the other person as a self in relation to their own self. They haven't gone through this cognitive, wiring and reworking of all of the variables from all these different sides that in turn gives them the kind of flexibility to consistently behave in what we would call a compassionate way or an empathetic way or anything like that. So there are instances where there's a disconnect, but in general, I would share your view that if you're looking for the good on a consistent basis, more often than not, you won't find it in the absence of intelligence. Nevertheless, the question becomes, well, so what? What then? Because obviously it's pointless, in my view, to suppose that you can teach morality through better psychology, or that through some sort of superior reapplication or reorganization of pedantic categories, you can raise children developmentally to be these perfect or at least thoroughly adequate moral beings. I don't see that happening. And again, I suspect that, without trying to put too much of a eugenicist twist on it, I think that there are genetic aptitudes that will directly impinge on what we're calling morality here. There'll be cases where dispositions and so on and so forth are affected by factors that are wholly outside of the cultural or the social environment. And so then, where does that leave you?
Well, there are a couple of different ways you could take that. I don't think that you can construct a society so perfect that people don't need to work on themselves. Um, the perspective of the spiritual tradition from which in which I've logged my hours of practice and in which I've invested the the time to understand Buddhism. Uh, Morality isn't something innate, it's something that comes from how you apply your mind. It comes from uh, recognizing interdependence. Can you enforce the recognition of interdependence? Can you therefore enforce a moral state of being? No, you can't. I mean, there's a distinction in the tradition between people who follow because of faith and people who follow because of reason. And the people who follow because of faith, that would be people who might have been born into a region that is culturally Buddhist, people who just want to show up at a temple and receive some kind of blessing. People who think it just sounds nice are kind of not really practicing. The people who follow because of reason are actually doing the Dharma. they're qualified as people who are able to keep the Dharma safe in the world and to propagate it and to realize the fruits of the path. Uh, Real, genuine morality that is not just deference to authority as part of a kind of cost-benefit calculus. Well, I'd like a favorable rebirth. I'd like, to get wealthy on account of my good karma or something like that, aren't really doing it. It's not actually moral. What's actually moral is people who have done the work to see the nature of reality and who, because they understand their interconnectedness with other beings, authentically act in a way that's conducive to the well-being of those beings, to the diminution of their suffering. So can you enforce it? No, but you can offer the opportunity for people to reach those potentials. Whether or not people want to exercise them and people want to carry the their understanding to a point where that seems like a reasonable thing for them to do is on them.
It is on them, and it holds true for every religion or any doctrine that at least implies that the world would be better if you believed and or did this. If I advance a doctrine that is interested in the destruction of the world, and I want to make the world a worse place, some sort of like anti-religion, and I come up with all these precepts and practices and so on designed to achieve this net lowering effect. In a way, I have the same problem. It's the problem of transmission, the transmission of morality. Because say I sincerely believe that the world ought to and must be this worse place that I conceive of. If I have a bunch of followers who may have less belief or no belief in that same ideal, then I'm encountering the same problems of people and religions who want to carry the world in a different direction. You'll have the 80% who may simply identify with the rituals and the organization because, let's say, I wear black robes all the time, or let's say I wear a bright scarlet red mask made out of birchwood or something, or I walk around with two dead calves, one in each hand that I drag. Whatever it is, maybe they think that's thrilling, so they get to dress up accordingly. Maybe the satisfaction of taking up a place or position in the hierarchy that's offered the organization, maybe that appeals to them, all so on and so forth. You could still have a 20% or so that is swayed by the arguments as arguments and comes to believe in the ideas as ideas. And so then you would say in the same case, well, this 20% authentically is approaching the subject matter and the vision, and the other 80% are inauthentically approaching it. But again, the practical problem remains. If you are someone who is desperate for the good of the world or even the bad of the world, if you want the world to be different, to become something else other than it is now, how do you get from point A to point B if you are relying on some group of people to become themselves more like you, to see things the way you do, to understand, to act in all of these ways that you can't calculate, sufficiently so that you can achieve, at least in part, this net effect?
Well, I think that no matter what you're doing, a certain amount of people in any movement are going to be along for the ride. They're not going to partake in the values, ideas, and standards that give the movement its impetus and direction. Now, I would respond to some of what you said by saying this. If you have this dark brotherhood that worships entropy and that is concerned with producing the lowest possible level of human consciousness and of destroying the environment and promoting war and famine and confusion and and uh, and nihilism. If you have, let's say we have this hypothetical group of people. Let's say that among those people, 80% of them are along for the ride, so to speak. That group of people, if they had been aesthetically attracted to the the signs and signifiers of let's say red robes in a Buddhist monastery, they'd be the 80% there either. They would be in that lower 2/3 or so of people who are emulating. All of them would be 100% of the the this sort of dark, sort of anti-spirituality would be in the 80% down. I think that the numbers, though, are artificial in this. Like, if you take this representative sample of the anti-war demonstrations, or if you take the New Age, because it's selecting something out of the population. It's selecting out people who identify with what is non-conventional. By definition, a UFO convention or meditation retreat or a psychedelic conference is not going to have anyone in the conventional bracket. And so we're not getting a representative sample of the population. We're getting a representative sample of the pre-conventional and the post-conventional. So it's cutting out a lot of people.
I'm not sure about that. It sounds to me like there's a fallacy involved there because you can take any member of the so-called conventional population, which is, let's say, the set that contains all other sets, and you can show that that person belongs to some subset. If I take the quintessentially bland, milquetoast, white person off the street in middle America, I can show that he or she belongs to subsets as well that are artificially contrived. I can say he is a 40-year-old Republican, or he is a Gulf War veteran, or he belongs to the group of people who have committed rape, or he's a car salesman, or maybe she is a widow, or maybe she is a mother, or maybe she's a spinster. So you can draw the circle around any kind of subgroup. And again, not saying that the numbers are literally exact, but if there's any truth to them at all, I don't see any reason that the same proportionality shouldn't exist elsewhere. I mean, when they do, IQ tests, for example, of course, IQ tests and the idea of IQ is now thoroughly controversial and so on, but statistically, if you know anything about statistics, you can take samples of sufficient size or with the proper scope and then make statements about things based on the rules of sampling. And it's possible that any one of these subcultures, UFO people, New Age people, the group that contains both, the group that contains those two and anti-Vietnam protesters, whatever your sampling size is, as long as it obeys the more abstract rules about how to sample, that 80-20 division could still apply.
Well, I think we could look at it this way, because no matter what, and when you look at a data set of people, you tend to get a bell curve. And of course, when you test for different aptitudes, people will fall on different places on the bell curve, but you'll still have the same curve. So if you give a sample of people a test that leans more toward visual learning, some people will be in the on one end of the curve, and some people will be on the other. But if you change the test around so it's about auditory learning, people will be in a different part of the curve. No matter what, most people are in the large portion of the curve in the center, and a few people are doing exceptional, and a few people are particularly bad. And if we look at it this way, I think we should expect to see that a few people are genuinely and exceptionally uh, uh, compassionate and wise, and a few people on the opposite end of the bell curve are genuinely and truly um, allied with entropy and nihilism. And most people are somewhere in between. And that's to be expected, because either one of those two extremes is exactly that. It's an extreme. It requires very special causes and conditions to produce as a scenario.
Well, I agree entirely. I accept that as a sort of natural fact. But the problem comes when, on a practical level, you want to transform that situation somehow into something different. If, for example, you want to convert some number of the people in between into that upper 20% statistic, how do you go about doing that? And my feeling is that that bell curve, supposing that it exists, is not just a mathematical abstraction. It actually reflects causes and conditions. So if there are people who in great numbers occupy the middle of the bell curve, it's not for reasons that exist in some acausal vacuum. It's because they exist in lives and circumstances that produce that result. Considering that, at least in principle, most of the people exist in that middle territory, you have a real problem on your hands, because what that means is that the nature, quote unquote, of human beings, even if we're saying that it's not ultimate nature, even if we're saying it's still circumstantial, but the nature of human beings, the average person, is going to be somebody who you really can't convert to that 20%. It's a practical impossibility, because they're already enmeshed in a whole causal network that includes not only their current circumstances, but an entire set of life circumstances. And there's no reasoning with them. Now, again, that to me can be accepted as a natural fact. I think it is a misused fact when it's cynically applied in the worldview of, for example, people on the political right, who hold as one of the pillars of their worldview that people can never be trusted. People are, assholes. People will always try to screw you over. Therefore, that's the state of the world. That's the way things are. Therefore, we should accept that, make no effort to change it. And so in that worldview, every foreign leader, for example, is an enemy of America. The nature of human life ought to be dog, eat dog, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying that, and I'm not promoting that view, because I don't take any satisfaction in it. But nevertheless, it ought to be some sort of limiting principle when it comes to efforts to change the world, whether to improve the world or to diminish the world. How do you do it when the basic disposition of people makes them ineligible to participate?
Well, I think there are two things that we need to bear in mind. One, sticking with Wilbur and his framework, there's a generalization that he points out that holds in nature, which is greater depth, less span. That is to say, that the more complex something is, the more it requires precise causes and conditions for it to flourish, and therefore the less of it there will be. The more levels there are in psychological development, the more opportunities there are for something pathological to occur, which will stall or retard that development. An illustration of this greater depth, less span principle would be the fact that there are necessarily fewer molecules than there are atoms, because molecules are made of atoms. And there are necessarily fewer cells than there are molecules, because cells are made of molecules, and so on. And the more levels there are to something, the less of it there will be. So there will always be fewer people who are genuinely exceptional. But the whole curve can move. What I mean by that is this. The upper 20% several hundred years ago could have been, of people we might call exceptionally moral, might still condone treating women as property and treating people of color as property. But as the culture itself becomes more civilized, the upper curve is something more rarefied still. You could say that the upper part of this distribution is now people who hold that all beings on the earth should be equal, or that all sentient life should be equal, so that you retain the same distribution, with the fewest people at the leading edge, but the whole group is moving forward as we move along. Now, that's one thing I want to throw out. The other thing is that, practically speaking, we can't move that process along very fast at all. We can't even deliberately engineer it. It's kind of the outcome of large-scale dialectical forces unfolding as people, vie against each other in the arena of ideas, and the tangible output of those ideas is history. And to try and accelerate that is misconceived, because it would require a level of control and foresight that nobody has. But in the meantime, this is where we stand. Who is going to sway the people in the middle? Let's assume we have this imaginary bell curve where there's 2% of the people who are exceptionally conscious, and 2% on the opposite end of the bell curve who are, let's say for the sake of argument, worshiping entropy and trying to promote nihilism and despair and confusion. Who is going to be able to mobilize the people in the center of the bell curve? Who will be able to instill them with more conviction? The people on the dark side, again, we're still speaking hypothetically, would try to atomize people and try to infatuate them with consumer goods and with clamoring to be on top of one another. People on the other side might try to get them to recognize their rational self-interest. They may recognize that the majority of people won't become truly compassionate, won't be imbued with genuine loving kindness that flows from a recognition of the real nature of reality, but as a pragmatic interim goal to see to it that we all survive, you could appeal to the rational self-interest of the people in the middle of the curve.
The pressure of being under any kind of moral injunction distorts an objective view. I don't really think that it's appropriate to say that because the bell curve moves, that it can be moved. It's a known fact that the earth moves. Nevertheless, if you gave me the task of moving it, I would have to concede it's impossible. And it's impossible for practical reasons. There's no way to get from me here in this circumstance, situation A, to me there, moving the earth somehow in circumstance B. Nevertheless, it's shown and it's known that the earth moves. In the case of human culture, for example, okay, we know that culture changes, and maybe you could even suppose that there has, at some point in the recent past, been an improvement, which is the name you give to the change between a situation A bell curve and a situation B bell curve. You might be able to say that the bell curve moved to the right toward the higher 20%. You might apply to that movement the moral evaluation that this was an improvement, a step in the right direction. But there's no way that you could say that that movement was not accidental, or that the movement itself might not be reversed the next time you take a snapshot of the bell curve. Because of that, saying that the bell curve moves, I don't think you can draw any kind of inference from that to how a person or a group might undertake to move it. You can start to imagine how you might do it, and you might even undertake it according to your imagining. But in my view, if you succeed, even then it's by accident. Because whatever vision of the world you have at the particular moment when you begin, that's a totally provisional and schematic vision. It's a shorthand, it's a caricature. It does not contain the world in its entirety, therefore it is a false reflection. Likewise, whatever image you have of where the world should be and where it should go is partial and provisional, and doesn't encompass the world as a reality. So even if you succeeded at that moment, at the end of the process, whatever your vision is still technically false, even though we might say it now corresponds. And of course, this has implications for any correspondence theory of truth, but again, it's as if by accident. So how you can adduce any kind of program or notion of how to mix in this vast causal network that is the world, you can't really. You still can try and you may succeed, but at bottom it's kind of like a non-linear equation. If you achieve the result you're looking for, it can only be through some sort of causal matrix that was totally outside of your grasp.
Well, bear in mind that in the two frameworks that I laid out, the purpose of the former framework was to acknowledge that you cannot, by any action, accelerate that movement if you assume that the whole system is moving in the direction of the good.
Well, that's what you assume.
But, well, I'm assuming that provisionally, because it's not intrinsic to my own feelings about this. It is something that is taken as given within the spiritual counterculture as a whole. Everyone from Strieber to McKenna to Wilbur, each of whom represents a very different segment of the spiritual counterculture, seems to take the view that there is some kind of conscious evolution happening. And I'm not convinced that we have enough evidence to posit that. Strieber asks the Master of the Key, why are universes created? And the Master of the Key responds that being serves joy, and that on the whole, sentient life in the universe is moving toward a state of radiance, of conscious participation in the all, of ecstasy, of identification with the divine. McKenna talks about the transcendental object at the end of history. He talks about that as the summum bonum of all that is of value to human beings. Wilber traces the development of values and cognition and through human history, and says that they reflect in social structures and cultural structures, and that as the values, the material conditions, the cultural structures, and the social structures move, they are moving with the direction of what we would call good.